Okay, guys, just really quickly here. This is Brian Mann, University of Miami, Assistant Professor, Kinesiology and Sports Sciences, letting you in on a little bit of the stuff that we teach at the U that might be beneficial for those of you who are in strength and conditioning. Uh, right now, I want to look at this paper from Fernando Pareja Blanco, and I really love this paper. And anybody who has been seen me present, they know that I've gone over this one multiple times. I think this does a great job of explaining the different adaptations, and in doing so, it kind of draws everything back together. So let's go ahead and let's get to it. So in this paper, they did 8 weeks of training the squat and the assistance exercises that are listed in there. They did two different variations of velocity loss. They did about a 20% loss and a 40% loss. So what is this? What is velocity loss? We need to define this. Velocity loss is that as you fatigue, you're, of course, not going to be utilizing as many fast twitch motor units. And the greater the fatigue, the more of those high threshold motor units are going to drop out because they're typically fast fatigable. So then the more and more type 1 motor units you're starting to look at. Well, as that velocity decreases, what are the differences in adaptation? So they looked at a biopsy where they looked at the histochemical electrophoresis, for their fiber typing for the type 1 and type 2. They did an MRI to look at the muscle volume, and they did some various sprinting and jumping. So here is the squat program that they did. So you can see that they did velocity loss 20, velocity loss 40, how many repetitions they typically got per set, okay, for the 20 versus 40% velocity loss. Then you can see, we can look at those totals and we see how things change over time. We can see how by session 6 and 5, even session 4, the velocity loss 40 started to get roughly double the total volume in. So the number of repetitions isn't always significantly different. Sometimes it is. But we have to remember that from one repetition to the next, you might experience a significant loss. So we have to take that into account. We can see what the actual loss was, and by session 3, that's whenever we get up to our 20 and 40%. We've seen 19 and 50, 21 and 48. So we can see that there's some discrepancy from week to week, but it's recorded and reported. It's going to be tough to see anything right on the money for everybody. Now here are the changes in the cross-sectional area and the muscle fiber types percentages. Now the top is just the individual muscle fibers. So what was we're seeing the circumference that it's taking up. Then we see the percentage of fiber type, the percentage of fiber area. So the percentage of fiber type has to do with the numbers. Like this number of fibers are type 1, this number of fibers are type 2. Now, the difference with the fiber area is this takes into account the size of each individual muscle fiber. Now, we have to go ahead and, again, take into account that a type 1 and a type 2 fiber are typically different sizes. Type 2, we know, experience a greater amount of hypertrophy, so they will end up taking up more space than the type 1 if that is what is hypertrophied. And then down here at the bottom, we see the myosin heavy chain percentage. Okay, so these are just broken down into the 3. They have gotten rid of the intermediaries. And what do we mean intermediary? Well, if we come up to the second section, the percentage fiber type ATPAs, you see that there's type 1, type 2C. Now, anytime that you see a C, it's an intermediary between 1 and 2. Then we see type 2A, 2AX, so then that's an intermediary between 2A and 2X, so that we'll see some conversions. And then, so we need to take these into account. Now, with the different types of training, velocity loss 40 and velocity loss 20, velocity loss 40 is typically getting pretty close to failure for a lot of people. There's usually probably a rep or two left in the tank when you're about 40%, and some people won't even be able to get to that. But if we look at the velocity loss 40, we need to look here and see what happens. We see that for the cross-sectional area, just total, we go from 49.35 to 54.38. So roughly a 513 improvement versus the velocity loss on 20. They went from 4,800 to 52.17. Well, that's 417. So we see that the velocity loss 40 is definitely more effective for hypertrophy, if we're just looking at it from a gross type. Now, we also have to look at, if we look at the individual, right? We get down to the individual fiber types. Cross-sectional area of the type 1 from 43 to, up low 43s to high 47. So, almost 500. Is comparatively, the cross-sectional area of the type 1 fiber only went from 4070 to 4346. So we see that's a 270 improvement. So did the type 1 fiber increase in its size with the velocity loss 20? Well, absolutely it did, but not to the extent of the velocity loss 40. Then we look down and we see the 2A, 2AX, and 2X. And we can see that, hey, all three of these increased in size for the 40. The 2X was non-significant, but the others were. And then we see that we have not as great of an improvement for the 2A and the 2AX. And then we see the 2X was a difference. Now, there was no significant improvement, though, there was a significant improvement for the 2A, 2AX, and the 2X whenever we look at the time value, but there's no significant differences whenever we look at the time and group. Now, we're just going to hold on to that. Now, let's look at percentage fiber type. So not just the number, but the percentages. We see that we had a 3% increase in the type 1 fiber percentage, and we see we had about a 2% decrease in the type 1 percentage. The 2C, which is the intermediary, it increased about 0.2, so non-significant for the velocity loss 40, and it improved 1.1, which was not significant, but it's noteworthy. So what we're probably seeing here is a fiber type conversion from type 1 towards type 2. And if this training was longer than 8 weeks, we might have seen that fully come to fruition. The type 2A and the type 2AX and the type 2, we see basically no changes in those, in the velocity loss 40. In the 2AX, we see a fairly significant decrease there, which probably is converting the 2X towards 2A fibers. And if we add those up, I bet that might start to become significant. For the 2A, we see a improvement of about 5%. The 2AX, we see a decrease in that. And the 2X don't change a whole lot. Now, that is interesting because most people, as they start training, they see decreases in those 2X and they go towards the 2A. Now, these are the most explosive, fast fatigable fiber. And a lot of people think, oh, that's the one that you want to have. Well, typically you want the 2A, and you typically see the 2A unless somebody's been blessed by the hand of God. And then they've got tremendous amounts of 2X, and they will actually accumulate significantly greater 2Xs. The only time that you see people with tremendous 2X fibers are whenever they do biopsies of the elite. Dr. Andy Galpin and Jimmy Bagley recently had a study from the weightlifting world championships where they saw tremendous amounts of type 2X fibers. But we typically don't see that in most of the lay population. So those 2X typically start converting towards 2A, which we see happening here. So if we look at the percentage of the fiber type area, again, we see increases in type 1 for the 40, decreases in type 2, essentially. And then in the velocity loss 20, we see a small increase. It's definitely not significant for the type 1. We see an increase in the type 2C intermediary, so we see a type 1 to type 2 conversion. Type 2A has moved up. Type 2AX, the intermediary, has decreased, so we're probably seeing that increase in 2A from a decrease in the hybrids. And then if we look at the bottom, we can see that whenever we take away the intermediaries, we see an increase in the 1, we see an increase in the 2A, we see a major decrease in the 2X for the 40 group. And then whenever we look at the 20, we see a very small decrease in the type 1 percentage, a increase in the 2A, and a decrease in the 2X, indicating the fiber type conversion. So I think that that's pretty cool that we can actually see that the differences that are existing between these two programs, that, hey, you know what, there are some differences. It's not just about the movement, it's about how much fatigue you accumulate within that movement that leads to different types of hypertrophy. Now here is based off of the MRI, and we see here, top left is the quadriceps as a whole. Then they broke it down to rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, and intermedius, and vastus medialis. And we see it's really what would be expected, that, hey, the velocity loss 40 group saw significantly better hypertrophy. You know, as we just saw from the previous slide, but here's a graphic illustration that, hey, you want just hypertrophy? Go to failure. Go to that 40% velocity loss. You see a greater time under tension, and then you're going to lead to a greater hypertrophy. Now, let's look at some of the changes in the neuromuscular performance variables. Well, the 1RM, it went up about 14 kilos for the 40 group. It went up about 19 kilos for the 20 group. And we see that there was a bigger standard deviation for the 40 versus the 20. So, hey, you know, what I can say here is that for strength, the velocity loss 20 seems to be better. We have fewer repetitions performed, but we still have a greater strength increase. The average velocity, and we're going to leave these alone. The average above 1 meter per second, below 1 meter per second. Basically, they're looking at the average speeds of whenever they were doing the 1RM testing. Now, we see that we had, overall, we had about a 0.11 improvement in the average velocity for the 20, and we only see about a 0.6 for the 40. We see a 0.01 increase over the 1 meter per second for the 40, but we see a 0.08 for the velocity loss 20. So we see that they are better at the velocity end of the spectrum. And then we look towards the force end of the spectrum, which was the speeds that are lower than 1 meter per second. Because typically the 1 meter per second cutoff is that I know that anecdotally myself and Dan Baker, well, our squats, our guys typically achieved peak power at about 1 meter per second. So I think this is why they have chosen that number to look at. And then below 1 meter per second towards the force end, again, we mentioned that 0.09 versus the 0.15 meters per second difference, which could be easily attributed to the improvement in 1RM. Now the counter movement jump and the 20. Now these are where I think that this is really interesting for sport. Now we see that both groups did improve. The velocity loss 40 saw about a 1.5 centimeters, and that's non-significant, but it's approaching significance, versus a 3.7% improvement in I'm sorry, I said percentage, centimeter, 3.7 centimeter improvement in the velocity loss 20 group. Now, so if you want to be able to jump higher, it appears that the smaller velocity loss that has the higher velocities would be better. Now, if we look at the 20 time, this is where things get a little hairy, because both of them are insignificant. But if we also have to take into account something called minimally clinically important difference, or minimal clinically important difference. If we look here, we see 2.99 to 3.02. For the 20, we see a 3.00 and a 2.99. Now, there's a study that came out from Jerry Mayhew and myself and a few others where we looked at the smallest worthwhile change in the 40, and we saw that, and granted this is the 40, but I believe we saw it at 0.01 or 0.02 seconds. Now, this is going to be important because while we see on the velocity loss 20 that it did not meet the criteria for a significant improvement from the p-value, it did, however, register as the MCID, or smallest worthwhile change. So what we can see is that, yeah, we did see a statistical improvement in speed here, but we didn't for the time of the 20. They actually got a little bit slower. Now, what does this indicate? Well, speed is a velocity component. So if I'm able to move faster, then of course I'm going to be seeing better improvements at the speed. Now, I also want to point out that with the 20 is a very interesting distance. It's a common distance for sprinting in soccer and some other sports. The downside to this, though, is that whenever we're training the velocity into the spectrum, the changes typically don't happen until post 20 meters. So simply seeing an improvement in the 20-meter time is going to be huge. If there are some studies looking at things like kayak, and that basically they found that strength was the number one improvement for the first 10 and up to 20 meters. And beyond that, there were other means. Really, Bushek-Snader said it best, in my opinion. You squat for your 10, you clean for your 20, and 20 and 30, and then beyond that is sprinting. And I think that's very true. That we didn't see an improvement here in this 20 time. Now, why was that? Now we have to take into account what was the methodology of the timing. Now, most of the time, whenever we see sprinting, you'll see that they started from a 3-point stance. So then we would see massive improvements in strength would lead to improvements in the starting speed. Well, here we don't, even though we saw a massive improvement in the strength, but because they went from a 2-point stance. So they weren't able to utilize that force because of the change in position and starting position. So looking at the differences in joint angle specificity. So that's a long way to say that, hey, if they would have done a different style of sprint, or possibly even taken it out to a longer distance, those values very well might have become significant. And this is another reason why you need to read the full paper rather than just the abstract, or rather than just the conclusion of the abstract, to be able to have greater context. So, if we would have changed the sprint type up, again, even at the 20 time, we might have seen a significant improvement. But as it is, we didn't. If we would have taken out to 30 and 40 meters, then we might have seen a difference there as well, even with the 2-point. But we didn't do that in this study, and that's all speculation on my part. But I wanted to bring those up because I think that's very, very important to know and think and be able to apply that sort of context for whenever you're looking at other research studies on your own. Now, the question always is, hey, what's better? This is asking what's better is a loaded question, because the answer always is that it depends on the goal. Well, if your goal is physique and you're looking at bodybuilding and just trying to put on mass, then of course just the hypertrophy is better. But what if your goal is jumping? Well, we saw a 9.5% in the improvement in the counter movement jump versus 3.5% with favoring the 20% velocity loss. So jumping, well, what's the jump height dependent on? Well, the speed of the center of mass upon takeoff. So whenever we trained with lower fatigues at higher velocities, we saw a better improvement in the jumping ability. Okay, sounds good. What if your goal is strength? Well, either one is fine for strength. Both saw a significant improvement in strength. But the velocity loss 20 saw an 18% versus a 13.4% improvement. Now, in other populations, we might even see that flip. But the thing to take into account is that when we did significantly less volume for the velocity loss 20, and they still saw better results in strength. So maybe by hitting it with higher volumes, we're actually inducing overtraining rather than the strength adaptation. But again, if the goal is hypertrophy, then that doesn't even matter. Speed, I'm going to say it's probably the velocity loss 20. It's a slight improvement versus a small increase, and I guess we could say decrease in speed, increase in time. Again, as we talked about last time, the times get a little, in the previous video, the times get a little hairy for looking at the differences there. But I think that that velocity loss 20 is going to be really, really good. And if they would have gone from a 3-point start using a touchpad or even just a position, they're going to see better improvements. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you found it informative. This is just a little snippet of some of the stuff that we teach here at the U, at the University of Miami. Again, we're getting coaching education courses up online, things that will be able to take and get CEUs out of. Just trying to do what I can to push the field and help educate those involved in strength and conditioning. If you have any questions, of course, you can always get at me on social media at jbrianman. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. We'll hopefully be able to get the message out to more people. That's it for today, guys. Thank you for stopping by.